DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
Hello and welcome to United Through Diabetes. This is DRWF's inaugural national event. To give you a flavour of the organisation and our work, I'm going to be talking to the founders who are based in the United States, Mike Retchell and John Alahousas, together with his wife Diane, plus our UK Chief Executive Sarah Tutton. We'll then turn to look more in depth at some of the important work we're funding with a number of our researchers here in the UK. So first, I'd like to welcome Mike Retchell. Hi Mike, maybe you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Hello, this is Mike Retchell from Washington, D.C. I am the co-founder of Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation, and we work very hard on this.
So you've got that very personal connection with diabetes. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how that came about?
Certainly. 47 years ago, my 2.5-year-old son was diagnosed with diabetes. He was my first child. My wife and I were babes in the woods. I had no absolutely real idea of what diabetes was. First thing I said to her is, how long does this take to get over? And that was obviously a very ignorant question, and it's been with us for years. Subsequently, a few years later, my daughter was also diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And most recently, in the last month, unfortunately, my oldest grandson has been diagnosed as type 1 diabetic. It was quite devastating. We were heartbroken. He's a great young guy, and he just graduated from the University of Florida. Is off to his career, and we were just so worried about him. Luckily, he's a really smart kid and doing very well with his routine to getting into it. And in the next week, I believe he's going to be getting on a pump.
So when you set up DRWF in those early days, what was your purpose? What was your drive? And what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, for years, my wife and I and most of our friends had been elicited into raising money for the diabetes cause for millions of different ways. We didn't think we were getting anywhere. And I thought that the thing that was missing is that most of the diabetes groups were more oriented to the researchers and the doctors and not the patients. So we really formed DRWF, reluctantly, I will say, because I knew it was going to be a heck of a lot of work. And we did it so we could have an organization that was for and of the patients.
What have you celebrated along the way in all those years?
Mostly survival. Diabetes research has gone very slowly, unfortunately. When we started, we were testing our son's urine in the middle of the night and putting a flashlight on his face, make sure he hadn't fallen into a coma. We have focused, though, on the research area in the area of transplantation, since that is the one thing that would actually change people's lives that have the disease now.
So moving on, I suppose, looking to the future, what are your hopes for the future in terms of diabetes research and development, treatment, and maybe a cure for type 1?
First diabetologist I ever met told me that the cure was just around the corner, and that's a long corner. But we're working on every entry. You just have to hit every direction. because you don't really know where it's coming from.
Many thanks, Mike. And now we'll turn to co-founders John and Diane Alahousas. Welcome to you both. Do you want to start, John?
Absolutely. My name is John Alahousas. This is my wife, Diane. We have both been volunteers raising funds for diabetes research since the 1970s. By profession, I am a advertising and marketing executive.
Yeah, and Diane, if we could just ask you your experiences over the years, what have you sort of found working in this area has been, shall I say, demanding or challenging? How's your work with the charity been?
I'm just the power behind the throne.
Of course.
That's it. I keep everything running smoothly.
Yeah. She's able to put up with me and the long hours. Our children are not have not been struck by this disease, thank goodness. So we didn't have to do what Mike and Maureen had to do, and now what Chris is doing with his son Mac. We're going to work for this, and we know that self-management is the key to longevity in diabetes. That is probably the most important lesson and program that we, as this diabetes network, has been able to spread throughout the countries that it is involved in. Other groups don't do that as much. We do, because we see it, and personally that I can see Chris every day and see that he's alive at 50 years old, when there are other people that I know that were much younger, and they're no longer with us.
Staying well until a cure is found.
Absolutely.
And what was and what is the aspiration for DRWF? How has that development as an international charity with groups in the US, the UK, France, Sweden, Finland and Norway, how has that contributed to the wider reach and impact of the group?
Diabetes is not a US disease, and it is not a UK disease. Okay, diabetes doesn't recognize borders. So we wanted to found a diabetes research charity that would be a network that would be able to raise funds throughout the world and fund the best diabetes researchers in the world.
Okay, so moving on from that, I suppose, looking to the future, what are your hopes maybe for the next 40 years in both the US and those other countries? Where do you see it going?
We look forward to the day when researchers will be able to announce that we have finally found the cure for type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I look forward to the day when diabetes research charities will no longer be necessary. But until that day, we have to work as hard as possible, raising funds and funding the best researchers in the world.
Yep. Well, thanks again for joining us. Now let's turn to our UK CEO, Sarah Tutton, who's also a board member of Diabetes Wellness Norge. Good to see you, Sarah. So maybe picking up from the creation of DRWF in the US, how did it develop in the UK over the last 25 years?
We're a relatively small group, as you know. We're only a team of 15, and actually it's taken 25 years to kind of get to that stage. So we remained a very small group of just half a dozen or so people for the first few years. One of the first things that we did with the intention of funding research, one of the first things that we did was to set up a research advisory board, and we recruited Professor David Matthews from Oxford to help us to do that. Our entire focus was on funding credible research that was going to give us the best opportunity to understand the causes, treatment, management, and ultimately the cure of diabetes. So it was really important that we set up that research advisory board, and we became members of the AMRC, the Association of Medical Research Charities, to ensure that we had really robust processes in place to help us to do that.
And then on the back, I suppose, of the research arm of the charity, what did you then go on to develop?
We put in place a series of funding opportunities. So we established a fellowship, a clinical and non-clinical fellowship round for a duration of 3 years. And we introduced what we called at that time an open funding round. The open funding round was really to gather sort of translational pilot study data that would prove a concept and enable that research to go on and leverage capacity through higher value funding as part of a wider body of research at a later date. That funding round is actually no longer the open funding round, it's now our pump priming. But it was important for us to put in place an annual funding round that offered funding that was lucrative and attracted a high quality candidate from the research world, so that we knew that we were funding the best possible research that would help us with our long-term aim.
And then you've also moved the charity over the years into helping people living with all forms of diabetes. What happened there? What was the first sort of programs that you did?
Well, our strapline is staying well until a cure is found, and that really sort of underpins all of our program activities. You know, self-management is different from person to person. So it was an aim that we would provide information and educational programs, wellness programs, diabetes wellness programs, that would help people in their day-to-day self-management. So by providing practical information, practical tools to empower and inspire people to take good control of their diabetes in order to reduce the risk of associated complications. So that strapline of staying well until a cure is found really underpins all of our program activities. Staying well until the research that we are funding, we hope, will discover a cure for diabetes.
And what do you think the charity's biggest achievement to date has been?
Well, we're a small but dynamic team, as you know. So on a day-to-day basis, delivering those practical tools in their many forms, delivering a diabetes wellness newsletter to our supporters and beneficiaries, delivering a diabetes wellness educational program that has gone on to achieve a Quality in Care Diabetes Award. All of those things really resonate with us as a small team because they help us to demonstrate that we are having an impact on a daily basis for people with diabetes. But I think if we're talking about the research side of our work, then I would say that in our very early years, in our infancy, in 2004, we made an unprecedented award of 1.4 million to the Nuffield Department of Surgery in Oxford. And that was to establish a human islet isolation facility. And that facility has gone on to be pivotal to the UK islet transplant programme. And we still fund, 20 years later, we're still funding around 30% of the research team in that centre. And it's the islet isolation facility that harvests islets for human transplant across the UK. NHS went on to fund the clinical element of that programme in 2008 to ensure that there was equity of allocation and therefore transplant across the UK. And that's been a massive achievement for us because we didn't actually have 1.4 million at the time that we committed it. We worked hard. We made that commitment, and we've worked incredibly hard ever since to ensure that we have been able to honour that long-standing relationship because it has gone on to demonstrate such an impact for a small cohort of people with type 1 diabetes for whom hypoglycemia is both debilitating and so life-limiting and life-threatening. So that's a programme that has really demonstrated significant impact for us. So I'd say that that's perhaps just one of the many things that we've done over 25 years that has really had an onward impact in the diabetes community.
So how has the landscape of diabetes changed in the last 25 years?
When DRWF was set up in 1998 in the UK, I think there were around 1.9 million people living with diabetes at that time. So over 25 years, that's more than doubled. There are now more than 5 million people living with diabetes. predominantly type 2, around 90% of people with type 2 diabetes, 8% with type 1, and around 2% with other forms of diabetes. So it's grown exponentially. There's been an explosion of diabetes over that 25-year period, which makes our work today more important than it's ever been. There has been some fantastic advancements in diagnosis and treatment, management of diabetes in that time. I recall my mother-in-law had type 1 diabetes in the late 80s, and I remember her putting those very long needles and syringes and little vials of insulin in the fridge. And of course, we've moved on to pen insulin delivery devices. We have insulin pumps and much better technology in terms of glucose monitors, moving into CGM over that time. So there's been some fantastic advances over that time, but we still don't have a cure. The advances in technology have done fantastic things to help people improve quality of life, live with much better management on a day-to-day basis. And of course, that also reduces the risk of associated health complications. So these are massive advances, but they are only improving quality of life. Our ultimate goal is to find a cure for diabetes. So our job is not yet done. We're celebrating 25 years anniversary as an organisation that's supporting people with diabetes, but ultimately our goal is to celebrate the day when diabetes is no longer a threat to people's lives and the healthcare systems globally.
So Sarah, what would you say to the people actually here today attending UTD? How do they make the most of it?
Visit the exhibitor hub, where we've got lots of industry partners that are supporting this event. We've got CGM workshops going on, delivered by Dexcom, Abbott, Insulet, Advanced Therapeutics. There are many opportunities at today's event to talk to the researchers that have been involved in clinical and non-clinical research over the last 25 years. We've got some fantastic diabetes and related healthcare professionals. This really is a big opportunity to get as much as you possibly can, have your questions answered across the whole spectrum of diabetes and related health. Make the most of the opportunity, because it's all here for you today.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
Now we're turning to the vital research DRWF is funding with a cross-section of our researchers. First up is Professor David Matthews. Welcome, David. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm David Matthews. I'm Professor of Diabetes Medicine at the University of Oxford, and I'm the founding chairman of the Oxford Centre for Diabetes Endocrinology and Metabolism in Oxford.
That's fantastic. And you also have a role with DRWF. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, so I've been linked with the DRWF for a very long time. First of all, when they established themselves in the UK, and then I was the chair of the grants giving body for about 8 years.
So that was the Research Advisory Board, wasn't it?
It was the Research Advisory Board, and it was a delight to be chairing that board.
So do you want to just give us a bit of background about the UK PDS and what it is, what it's found over the years, what the results have been?
Yes. Well, the UK PDS was established by Robert Turner in 1978, which was the year that Pirard in France had noted and published that actually complications in diabetes were related to glucose levels. What was not known is that if you reduce the glucose levels, that the complications would come down. And Robert Turner designed this study of people who were newly diagnosed with diabetes and studied them over 20 years, a median of 10 years, but some people were in the study for 20 years and indeed beyond that. And this was the first time that it had really been demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that those people with type 2 diabetes were going to benefit from lowering the blood glucose. And it was on that basis, which was then published in 1998, that really the last 2.5 decades have been dedicated to people understanding that actually, first of all, we need new therapeutics to lower blood glucose. And secondly, that it's worthwhile treating type 2 diabetes early on and not just waiting around for complications to supervene.
So how has that changed type 2 diabetes management, would you say, guidelines?
Well, the guidelines now are fundamentally related to reducing glycemia, and that is entirely because the UK-PDS demonstrated that this is worthwhile. The guidelines over the years, and I've certainly been chair and co-chair of several of the iterations of the ADA and the ESD guideline committee, we've concentrated especially on trying to outline how best to treat diabetes, both early and in established cases, how to prevent cardiovascular disease supervening, but also how to prevent the complications of such things as heart failure and myocardial infarction when people have got established heart disease. And we're well along the road to understanding much of the way that we should treat those things therapeutically.
Can you move on to the Oxford Health Alliance? And you were a founding member of that. What does that group do?
Well, the Oxford Health Alliance was set up really specifically to try and look at community interventions for health. And we'd undertaken quite a few of these interventions, especially in Sri Lanka, and we'd established a multi-centre study covering China, indeed, and Mexico and the UK. And looking at community interventions, one of the things that we'd established was the concept that actually type 2 diabetes, yes, it's a pathological disease and it shouldn't be just simply dismissed as an environmental problem, but it nevertheless is caused by the environmental problem of our habits and our inclination these days to overeat. And gradually over these years, it's emerged that the real important aspect of diabetes prevention is going to be related to control of diet as well as increasing exercise, and especially control of weight. And in 2007 in Nature, we published an article called Grand Challenges in Chronic Non-Communicable Disease. And what this did is outlined a series of steps, in fact, 39 steps of things that we should be doing internationally to try and reduce the overall deficit that we have in non-communicable disease. And of course, non-communicable disease covers the issues specifically of trying to increase the amount of exercise that people take, to try and get people onto a healthy diet, really to try and stop people smoking, and to think about ways in which community behavior can be changed. That's quite an interesting one, because people always used to say 30 and 40 years ago that it was impossible to change people's behavior, easy to educate them, difficult to change behavior. But actually, government interventions, say, for preventing people smoking in public places, had a huge impact overnight. And can you imagine what it would be like in a restaurant these days, in the UK and in many parts of the world, if someone decided to light a cigarette? You don't need any form of policing for that. Everybody would go crazy.
So you were chairman of the DRWF board between 2012 and 2020. And how did the charity recognise your contribution?
Well, they very kindly recognised my contribution by launching a Professor David Matthews non-clinical fellowship, which I thoroughly don't deserve my name to be attached to that, but I'm extremely grateful. And it is a feature of the DRWF that they have, over the years, put in a really huge amount of funding into both clinical and non-clinical aspects of diabetes. The the funding from the charity has been outstanding, and it's been a huge privilege to be the chairman over those years of 2012 to 2020, giving out those grants, advised by a highly educated group of people who I also enjoyed meeting.
So, the landscape of diabetes diagnosis and treatment, how have you seen that change over the last 25 years of the charity's life?
Well, I think that there are some really quite specific things that I would mention. So the first would be an early one with the islet transplantation, and with the James Shapiro demonstration in Canada that islets could be approximately purified and given to people with diabetes, this particularly with type 1 diabetes, and that they would potentially reduce the amount of insulin that you needed. And in some cases, especially if you repeated this, you could get people off insulin altogether. And that was a big breakthrough. The DRWF have put a huge amount of effort into islet transplantation, especially in Oxford, and helped fund a huge laboratory there, which is a category for laboratory where these islets can be both purified and given to patients. It's surprisingly easy to give islets to patients. You just need to put a needle into their liver under a local anaesthetic and ultrasound, and they can just be inserted. So it's not like a normal transplantation of a kidney or something like that. It's a very easy procedure. Of course, the problem is rejection and availability of islets. And so over the years, we've still only running at a very low level of transplantation with islets. But the important thing about these observations is that it does mean that with new changes in understanding immunology and new changes, for instance, even in cell sorting, that this promises to be one of the definitive treatments for type 1 diabetes. So that's in type 1 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, there's absolutely no doubt that the fundamental difference now is to have two agents which we can give to people with type 2 diabetes which do not cause hypoglycemia. And those two agents are the gliflozins and the glutides. And these two agents are completely transforming what we understand about therapeutics. They're completely transforming our approach to being able to treat patients early in diabetes, because you essentially don't overdose people to the point of getting hypoglycemia. And both the gliflozins and the glutides are tremendously good at helping people lose weight. So we've got these what essentially are smart agents that we can give with dosages that are really not very critical, and especially not critical in terms of hypoglycemia, which really over the years are going to transform the way that we treat diabetes, especially now that the glutides are now available in a form that one can take orally. So fascinatingly, the gliflozins and the glutides work in entirely different ways at different parts of the body, and yet they both fulfill this wonderful function of saying, yes, the dose is not very critical, and no, they don't give you hypoglycemia, and yes, they both control diabetes extremely well, and they both cause weight loss. Weight loss is going to be the big thing for the next 10 and 15 years.
What, in your opinion, has been the biggest research breakthrough in that time?
I suppose I'd have to say, well, James Shapiro has to be up there with one of them as having both the idea and the outcome of actually managing to transplant islets. But I think that the really the Nobel Prize winning work is going to be related to the GLP-1 axis, and those are the glutides. And I'd say, those are worthy of Nobel Prizes in terms of the detailed science that went into that. The glyphosins are fascinating. The glyphosins are derived from agents that originate in the bark of the apple tree, and just progressively changed to be something that is non-toxic. And so those are wonderful agents, but the science behind those was both observational and developmental. But the real biological insight comes from those glutides of understanding how GLP-1 will both affect the islets, but also will affect your brain, and has other effects. And the combination of that with GIP, now available, with even bigger effects on diabetes in terms of weight and glucose control, means that we now have smart agents which are managing to work at different receptor sites. This is the way ahead for specificity of treatment, and a lot will now need to be done in terms of saying what agent is best for what individual person, as opposed to the big trials which lump everything together and say, in general, it works.
The shortage of the drug at the moment, though, is causing a few nightmares, I think.
Yes, well, that's an interesting side effect of something that's so successful that everybody wants it, and those are highly soluble problems. One of the problems, for instance, with semaglutide, which is what you're talking about in terms of shortages, is that its bioavailability is incredibly low, and so basically you need to give people 100 times the amount that they actually need to absorb, so that 99% of it goes down the loo, but all you need is 1%. And that is predicated on the whole idea, again, that the dose is not particularly critical. So it doesn't matter if 98% goes down the loo or 99% goes down the loo. You can take 1 or 2% of what it is that you're taking by mouth. But that's one of the problems. But actually, the capacity these days of genetic engineering of yeast and so on is so good that these really complex proteins can be mass produced in huge, in very large numbers, which is why, for instance, semaglutide is a huge success, because normally if you, 20 or 30 years ago, if you said, well, only 1% of the agent is available, everyone would throw up their hands and say, well, we can't possibly produce 100 times what you need for one tablet. And the answer is absolutely that you can. And this is all based on understanding the genetics of how you can trick yeast into producing proteins.
So, David, what's the future of academic research in the UK?
I think this is extremely difficult because we don't have proper funding from big organizations. So organizations like the DRWF are an absolute lifeline to researchers and are becoming more and more important. The Wellcome, which used to hand out really interesting grants to people, seems to be in a state now where it's not properly doing that, and there's a huge worry about what the Wellcome is doing. The Medical Research Council tends to fund pure science, and the NIHR is a wonderful organization from the government, that's the National Institute for Health Research, but doesn't tend to support people early on in their research programs. So I had the honor of being one of the NIHR senior research fellows, and I was extremely grateful for that position. And I went to many meetings relating to the NIHR. But on top of that, we have a real problem, which is that training of physicians now is like it can be thought of as an escalator. so that you stand on the bottom step and you arrive at being a consultant. And the escalator is an appalling thing because it's constrained by all sorts of issues that trainees have no control over. They're told where to go. Even the rotas are sorted out by someone that they can't even find out. So, I mean, some of the people leave the training programs just because the rotas won't allow them to get married, for instance, or won't allow them to take exams. And so there's a big loss of medics just because of the appalling nature of the training program and the way that it's administered. But it does mean that people like myself, I took sideways steps. I mean, I did a Doctor of Philosophy in Oxford. I did a DPhil. I've done other research projects working, for instance, with Robert Turner, as we've described for the UKPDS. All this is part of my background before I became an NHS consultant and then professor in diabetes. So this is the zigzag that you need people who are going to be in academia to take, and no one is allowed to zigzag at all. And talking to our younger trainees now, they despair of both the way that the training is organised and indeed the failure of almost invariably the failure of opportunities to do research. So I think I would say all power to the DRWF elbow in giving out these research grants. People are absolutely and most wonderfully grateful for that particular support. And it's a great pity that other sources are drying up.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
Hello, I'm Vicky Salem. I'm a consultant diabetologist and clinical senior lecturer at Imperial College London.
Super. Well, welcome, Vicky. Could you just talk a little bit about joining the DRWF Research Advisory Board, when you joined and what experience that's been for you?
Yeah, so I was invited a couple of years ago to join the board. There's usually a rolling membership, so I was invited to join a new position that had arisen. And I remember receiving the email. I was so delighted to receive it because the charity is a wonderful organisation for many reasons, and it really felt like a great honour. Lots of other very illustrious scientists sitting on that board. So as I said, I felt really, really chuffed and honoured to be invited.
Have there been any high points since joining?
Well, the meetings are fantastic. I mean, they're friendly, but they're extremely vibrant and impactful. I always learn something. And I really feel as though we are making an impact in terms of the diabetes research landscape. You know, it's scientifically very rigorous. Not only do we spend time interviewing candidates and choosing the best of the scientific applications, and there are many, but we also have a role in actually choosing how to spend the money. So how to divvy up the pots, how to, what to concentrate, for example, on early career researchers and seeding the ground for a fertile future.
And that's very important, isn't it? That early career researchers that DRWF are really good at supporting, maybe not with huge grants, but I think that makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does, for lots of reasons. If you can capture the very best of talent early on and divert them with a passion to a career in diabetes research, that is a huge achievement. Because, there are lots of people who do PhDs, for example, in cellular science or pharmacology, and they can really choose to go anywhere. So capturing people early in their career to devote that brain power and that passion and person power for the rest of their careers to diabetes research is really important. And often it doesn't take a huge amount of money at the beginning. Just a little pot of money is enough for an early researcher to start developing their independence, planning their own experiments, building up their own pilot data and their own USP, their own particular area of expertise, to then be really competitive for the much larger grants that will set them off on independent academic careers. And I think the other thing that I've noticed that the DRWF does really well is it's got a really interesting history of seeming to identify people who at the time might not necessarily have been in the box. They might not have been in the labs of the biggest, most famous diabetes professors, but they had something. And, now with the benefit of hindsight, these people are now real world leaders in diabetes research in their own right. And it was that seed that was planted with DRWF funding that helped them grow into what they are.
And can you now talk a little bit about the Diabetes Grand Challenge Award that you have been awarded? What difference is that going to make to your research and to overall diabetes research?
Well, I mean, it's totally transformative, and again, another huge honour. So this is a philanthropic injection of funding, a huge amount, 50 million, into UK diabetes research from the Steve Morgan Foundation. I've met Steve and Sally, the parents of the foundation, and in brief, there are three big umbrellas of funding pots. So there is stem cell derived beta cell replacement therapies, which is the area that I'm working in. There is understanding the immunology with a view to trying to prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes. And you'll speak to people like Sarah Richardson in Exeter who are great in that field. And then there's also a move towards trying to develop novel insulins to try to manage the disease better than we can at the moment. So a huge invigoration of the UK-based landscape, but at the same time, it's also allowed us to plug in and to really connect with the international community. It's raised our ability to really contribute to the field, and for people like me who've received fellowships that cement our career development for the next 5 years and fund us to do really world-class cutting edge research. It's totally transformative, and I'm so excited.
And just can you just touch a little bit on the research that you'll be doing? You mentioned it briefly there. If you could give us a brief view of what it will be.
Yeah, so I'm a clinician scientist, so I treat people with type 1 diabetes, but I've always been a research scientist during my clinical training and clinical career as well. And I've recently moved from the Faculty of Medicine to the Faculty of Bioengineering at Imperial College London. In fact, well before I graduated in medicine, I did my first degree in medical physics and engineering. So it feels a little bit like coming home to me, but this is a wonderful place for me to act as a pivot to pull together the best of UK collaborative science towards building or creating a device that is aiming to cure type 1 diabetes. And in brief, I'm working very closely with the best materials scientists in the country, Professor Molly Stevens, who leads the UK MRC Regenerative Medicine Hub, to develop bioprinting methods and materials, advanced biocompatible materials to house our cellular products. And inside that sort of jelly-like material, which we're planning to transplant into the patient, we are working with people like Ildam Ackerman at Birmingham University, who set up the best lab now in this country for the development of stem cell derived islets, beta cells. So we're looking to grow new beta cells in the lab, coat them in our advanced materials, aid a vascularization to make sure that they've got a healthy blood supply. We're working with immunologists to try to make sure that doesn't get rejected. And the ultimate goal is to print that into a jelly-like new organ almost that can be transplanted into people with type 1 diabetes. Because when people say to me they're looking for a cure in clinic, it's not about closed loop systems. I mean, closed loop systems are now becoming more and more available, and they're great. I mean, the tech revolution in type 1 diabetes really has been a revolution and has changed lives for the better, immeasurable better in the last 10 years, certainly within my recent clinical experience. But there's still a mental load attached to that. There's still an external device that sometimes can go wrong. There's still that worry, that presence. So when people talk about a cure for type 1 diabetes, what they're hoping for is some sort of transplant that is a beta cell replacement therapy, and that's what we're working towards.
And do you see that, you mentioned 5 years, is that your goal?
Oh, goodness. I mean, everyone always asks that question. So the answer is that there are already clinical trials from fantastic companies that grew out of American academia that are now recruiting. Also in the UK, Newcastle and Oxford are leading the way there to recruit people into the Vertex trials, which are using stem cell derived beta cells to transplant back into people to cure their type 1 diabetes. And that's it feels like a miracle, because I remember when I left medical school, the concept of using stem cells to treat diabetes seemed like science fiction. It's now science fact. And there are people who are achieving insulin independence, having been transplanted with cells that were grown from embryonic stem cells. But those patients still need to be fully immunosuppressed. So it's not a cure for everyone, because the risks of that are too great to use for everyone. But as a proof of concept, we're there. So now the next big challenge is to be able to use those cells reliably for everybody. And that means immunoprotecting them so that they don't get rejected or destroyed again. And that's a huge challenge. We think that material science can help. Others are working on actually intrinsically editing those cells to make them hide from the immune system. Probably the solution will be a mixture of both or other solutions. And I think we'll get there. I don't know. I don't know whether I'll see it in, widespread use in my clinical lifetime, but I can see it happening. And as I said, that's the hugely exciting part of the story. It now feels like a tangible reality. I think that the other thing that the DRWF has been great at is creating these bridges between the public, people living with diabetes, and people like me, doctors, researchers. And that's hugely important, and carry on, because we can't really understand and do the right research and ask the right questions without that interaction.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
So I'm Professor Paul Johnson. I'm Director of the Oxford Islet Transplant Programme here in Oxford, and also Professor of Paediatric Surgery and a Consultant Paediatric Surgeon.
So the landscape of diabetes diagnosis, treatment and care, how has that changed over the last 25 years?
I think there have been enormous changes over the last 25 years in diabetes management. Some of those have just been gradual changes, and there have been a number of landmark changes as well. And certainly one of the big things, of course, has been the development of technology and the closed loop. But in my particular field of transplantation, there have been big advances in the field of islet cell transplantation, and those continue to develop year by year. Yeah.
You can give us a very quick sort of overview of what islets are and what they do.
Yeah, so the pancreas is made up of two main types of cells. It's made up of what we call the exocrine tissue, which is about 98% of the pancreas, and that makes the enzymes that digest food. And the other part, which is the 2%, the smaller amount, are these little balls of cells scattered through the pancreas called islets. Islets of Langerhans is the full name. And the islets make the hormones, including insulin. And these little balls of cells are insulin producing, but they also make the other hormones like glucagon, somatostatin. And what we know is, in terms of for normal glucose control, you need those cells to be working together in harmony, in terms of a bit like a brake and an accelerator. They work together in terms of making sure the optimal control of the glucose. In type 1 diabetes, what happens is that those cells get destroyed. We think they get destroyed by the body attacking them for whatever reason, and therefore those are destroyed. So therefore the pancreas is no longer producing insulin. And what we are doing in the form of both whole pancreas transplantation and islet transplantation is basically transplanting those cells that make insulin. So we're giving the ability for people to have their own insulin producing cells back. Now, in a whole pancreas, that is a very major operation, and you are then transplanting the whole of the pancreas, including that 98% of tissue which is making the food enzymes, which actually in diabetes are working perfectly well. Now, what we usually do that is it's a very successful operation because you don't lose any of the islet cells, you put the whole thing in. And we usually do that when someone is needing a kidney at the same time. And you can justify that because you're needing the anti-rejection drugs for the kidney, and the operation, although it makes it a bigger operation, you are having a significant operation anyway by having the kidney transplant and the pancreas added. If you look at the outcomes of that, then a large number of patients come off insulin altogether, and that is really a very successful treatment. But it is a major operation compared with a minor procedure. The islet transplantation, on the other hand, just takes a pancreas from a donor in exactly the same way as you would with a whole pancreas. But instead of sewing the pancreas in, we take the pancreas off to the islet isolation facility or the islet extraction facility. And that is the key facility that was funded by DRWF here in Oxford. And that's a state-of-the-art facility. It has to be what we call a GMP clean room. It has 4 different levels of cleanliness of room. And this is a highly technical process in terms of extracting these cells. But for the patient, what they get is just a very small number of a small amount of tissue diluted in a drip bag, and it's run into the liver just like you're having a drip on the ward, although you have a tube put into the liver under local anesthetic, like being at the dentist. And patients are awake for that. They have a little bit of sedation, a little bit of intravenous whiskey, if you like, to make them feel nice and calm. And that takes about 15 to 20 minutes to infuse those cells in. And then they go home a couple of days later. So no big cut in the tummy, the infusing the cells. Now, the extraction process is not as efficient as having a pancreas where it hasn't been touched at all. And so the success of islet transplantation is not quite as predictable as whole pancreas transplant in terms of coming off insulin. But in terms of reversing some of the complications of diabetes, so hypoglycemic unawareness, severe hypoglycemic unawareness, which is life-threatening. And that is patients who have had every other treatment, all the different pumps, etc., attempted or at least considered, and they're still getting life-threatening hypos without any warnings. And for those, islet transplantation is highly successful and it's minimally invasive. And that is really the main group of people we are transplanting at the moment. But we're also using these islets for patients with a kidney if they are contraindicated to have the bigger operations. So older patients or patients with heart disease or other contraindications for such a big operation, we can also give islet cells in that capacity as well. So that really explains what islet transplantation is.
Can you talk about that unique relationship that the Oxford Islet Transplant Programme has forged with DRWF since 2004?
Yeah, so the relationship that we have with DRWF here in Oxford has been absolutely invaluable over many years. We initially applied to DRWF for a small amount of funding just to refurbish our existing islet isolation laboratory. But then with the changes of the tissue directive and the various rules with regard to tissue processing, we needed to develop and build a totally new facility. And we then approached DRWF about that. And we were really fortunate to be given generous funding by DRWF to the tune of 1.2 million. And we were able then to build a state-of-the-art islet isolation facility, which is one of the leading facilities in Europe. And ever since then, we've had a really close relationship with DRWF, both in terms of ongoing funding for 3 positions within our laboratory, 3 essential laboratory positions, both the facility manager, the facility deputy manager, and also a coordinator. Each of those 3 posts absolutely essential for the running of the lab. But also it's been a 2-way relationship. We've also supported DRWF. We've expanded the awareness of DRWF in the transplant field. And also we've had a number of different occasions when DRWF staff and also patients have visited the facility and learnt more about the whole awareness of islet transplantation as a treatment for a certain group of patients with diabetes. So the relationship has been invaluable, and in turn, it then had an impact on the whole of the islet transplant program in the UK, because we are one of 3 facilities nationally, but we are the only facility funded, originally built by a charity, and that now is one of the leading facilities for providing clinical islets around the country for patients to receive, as well as research islets for a number of leading researchers who require quality islets to do their research to try and find a cure both for type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So the relationship really has been massively significant.
So a huge impact then that DRWF funding has had in the past and continues.
Absolutely, a huge impact. The funding that has come through has obviously built the facility, but then from that has led on to many different collaborations and patient benefit, both here in the UK and also further afield.
Can you talk about the future then of islet transplantation, both harvested and stem cell derived? What does that look like?
I think we're at a very exciting time in the field of islet transplantation at the moment. We are getting consistently good results with cadaveric islets from organ donors, and there is still a lot of improvement that we can still do, not only in the way that we get those islets out and the efficiency and the numbers of islets we can consistently get, but also in strategies to enable those islets to engraft into the patients in order to make them not only work better to start with, but to survive longer. So there's a lot of development there. But as we move forward, there's also going to be the need and indeed the realization of an alternative source of islets. And a lot of work has been done internationally, both for using stem cell derived islets, but also islets derived from animal tissue. And we're at the stage now where those stem cell derived islets, which a few years ago we thought was some futuristic idea, actually now coming into clinical trials. And here in Oxford, we're involved in 2 clinical trials that will be starting this autumn, which are using stem cell derived islets to try and reverse diabetes. And we know from the initial results of one of those studies, which started in the US and is now coming to the UK and Europe, that they seem to be very encouraging indeed. And then the second trial, the great advantage about that is that it's going to be transplanting these cells without the need for the immunosuppression or anti-rejection medication. And I think if that trial does work, then that will be a real game changer. And then we can start to transplant more patients. And indeed, my whole aim, of course, of islet transplantation originally is to move it through to children soon after diagnosis. And I think if we don't need to give immunosuppression and we can do a transplant with minimal invasive techniques with little side effects and morbidity, then that really does enable us to expand the field enormously and benefit a huge number of people.
So looking back over 25 years of the charity's existence, what do you see as those major breakthroughs?
Well, I think the DRWF has mirrored those breakthroughs in diabetes management that I alluded to at the beginning of this interview. And I think that we have seen a number of different transitions, and then we've seen a number of different major advances. But I think it's very interesting, even the major advances usually have built on a long time of hard work with multiple people, and then 1 or 2 people then put that jigsaw together or make one key stage as key step change that then changes that whole area. But DRWF have mirrored that 25 years and they continue to do so. And I think by DRWF funding a number of different strategies, it means that they've actually enabled that progression over the last 25 years to really to benefit patients. Rather than putting all their money in one particular area, I think being able to put these things in parallel. And as I always say to any group that I speak to, we mustn't see these treatments as in competition with each other. The whole aim is to find the right treatment for the right person. And it maybe will use combinations of strategies to reverse diabetes ultimately, and very much a patient-centered approach rather than a doctor-centered or a technique-centered approach is absolutely critical. And so I think the profile and the portfolio of investment of DRWF and their funding for research has been really critical. And I think, that's been a major step in terms of helping us achieve our goals.
And we're showing this video at the United Through Diabetes event, where people are coming along to learn about good self-management, about the research that we funded. Have you got a message for those people as a holistic message about living with their own diabetes?
Yeah, I think the first message I would like to say is that we are all working as hard as we possibly can in order to try and reverse this really debilitating disease. And actually, it's the inspiration of seeing patients and talking to patients and treating patients that is what spurs us on. We're not just doing this as some academic or clinical exercise. We're doing it in order to actually treat patients and make your lives better. In terms of hope, there is no doubt about it that this is an exciting time to have diabetes in terms of the new treatments that are available. And I think we can give true hope rather than false hope, in the sense that over the next 5 to 10 years, there will be significant improvements in the way we can manage. And I say this combination of approaches, and I think the key thing for us as clinicians and scientists is for us to come together and look at what we're doing and collaborate together rather than have different silos. And I've always pushed that very strongly, both in my clinical work, but also when I was president of the International Pancreas and Islet Transplant Association. The whole aim we wanted to do then was not to have independent therapies competing with each other, but to say, actually, let's bring these together, let's look at what's right for individual patients. And now we routinely do joint clinics where we would have a whole pancreas transplant surgeon, we'd have an islet transplant surgeon, myself, and we'd also have a diabetologist who is very experienced in technology. And by doing that, a patient can come in and we can match the best treatment for that patient, rather than the historical model where you would go to one particular clinician who was an expert or was very keen on promoting one particular treatment, and none of the others were offered. So that, I think, is the future approach. And there are some many exciting things coming in the next few years, which we hope to be able to translate to the bedside and treat patients with.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
So my name's Sarah Richardson. I'm an associate professor in cellular biomedicine, and I'm also one of the new Steve Morgan Foundation Type 1 Diabetes Brand Challenge Fellows. And I'm based at the University of Exeter.
You received an award from DRWF. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so back in 2010, I received one of the DRWF non-clinical research fellowships, and this was aimed at trying to investigate the role that enteroviruses may play in the development of type 1 diabetes. I've been very lucky to have access to a very rare biobank of tissue that comes from individuals who've sadly died at or close to onset of type 1 diabetes. And we were using this biobank to see if we could find evidence that enterovirus may be present within the pancreas of these individuals. And what this would do would give us supporting evidence to go alongside other emerging evidence in the field that enteroviruses may be involved in the development of type 1 diabetes. This has got really big implications for in the future. If we can prove that enteroviruses may have a role, we may well be able to develop vaccines against these particular strains of viruses in the future that could prevent people from developing type 1.
So since 2010, what has happened in terms of that research?
So during my fellowship that I had with the DRWF, we were able to strengthen that evidence that enteroviruses may be present within the pancreas. And we were also able to identify why it is that the pancreatic beta cells, the cells that produce insulin, why they may be so susceptible to attack by these particular viruses. And what we were able to show with one of my PhD students, S.A. Iffy, was that a receptor that this virus attaches to enable it to get inside the cell is actually expressed and present within those pancreatic beta cells, which might explain why they are so susceptible to that infection. So that, along with the gathering evidence that enteroviruses may be present in very low levels in individuals with type 1 diabetes. So what has emerged from that is we've managed to bring together a lot of collaborators from right across the world, using another pancreas biobank from the network of pancreatic organ donors with diabetes, an initiative in the US. And we've brought together what's called the NPOD virus. And that's a team of scientists from right around the world with very different expertise who have applied themselves to this question to try and really prove whether we can find evidence of the virus within the pancreas. And these studies have really helped come together and reinforce the evidence that these viruses may play a role. And this has been sufficient for a company to now go forward to generate an enteroviral vaccine against the particular strains that we think may be involved in a majority of individuals. And this vaccine has now been rolled out into phase 1 trials to check safety. And then now those trials were very successful. Safety looks very good, and the ability for the vaccine to help prevent infections is also looking very promising. So they're now looking at phase 2 trials to see whether we can start looking at the next steps to push that forward. So it's a really exciting outcome, and I hope that this may in the future be a possibility for us to immunize people who are genetically at risk of developing type 1 diabetes and potentially prevent some of those cases in the future.
How would you know if they are genetically at risk?
So there are a lot of tests already out there, a lot of ability for us to be able to do that. Teams in Exeter and around the world have developed a type 1 diabetes genetic risk score. So essentially someone can have a blood sample taken and they can look for specific markers in their DNA to determine whether they're at higher risk of developing type 1 diabetes. So this is a relatively straightforward process to do. And there are schemes within the UK now where we're starting to see if we can roll that out into a more general population.
That's all fairly amazing stuff, isn't it? So this film is being shown at our event, United Through Diabetes. It's a large, as we call them, Diabetes Wellness Day. Have you got a message there for people living with diabetes who and why and why this is such a good event for them to come along to?
I think these types of events are incredibly important for several reasons. One, I think it gives patients and individuals who support people living with type 1 diabetes the opportunity to learn more about the condition and how they can live well with it. In addition, I think it gives you a unique opportunity to talk to researchers who are at the cutting edge of the field trying to develop our knowledge. And I think that's important for several reasons. One, I think you can learn about the research that's happening in the condition, but equally, it's an opportunity for people living with diabetes to feed back the things that mean the most to them, to the researchers, and that helps us to guide some of the directions that we may take our future research in.
DRWF, staying well until a cure is found.
Hi, my name's Shivani Misra and I'm a diabetes consultant and a researcher at Imperial College London.
And what were you awarded back in 2012?
So I was awarded the Sutherland Earle Clinical Fellowship from DRWF to undertake a PhD.
And you now are a member of the DRWF Board of Trustees?
That's right, yes. I mean, a few years ago, I was invited to join the Board of Trustees and I was delighted to accept because I've had such a personal and enjoyable relationship with DRWF since that initial PhD funding. So it was a no-brainer really to be able to give back to the charity.
What's your honorary consultant role?
So I, at the moment, am a full-time clinical academic. So I am funded by the Wellcome Trust now to undertake research full-time. However, I still see patients in my clinics, and I do about a clinic a week at my local hospital, where I see people with unusual forms of diabetes or people with early onset type 2 diabetes, which is now my area of expertise and interest.
So since being awarded the Sutherland Earl, can you just talk about that journey and what's happened since?
Yes, of course. So since getting the funding, I mean, I obviously finished my PhD, but the really impactful part of my PhD was knowing that I was hooked on clinical diabetes research, and I wanted to do it in the long term and not just be a clinical consultant that did full-time clinical work. So obviously the research had findings itself, but on a personal level, it made me enthusiastic about pursuing research. And then I was able to secure Wellcome Trust funding to continue my research full time, which is where I'm at the moment.
And what about the impact of the My Diabetes study? Can you give us some background to that?
Sure. So the study was set up quite a while ago now to basically look for genetic forms of diabetes, which are called monogenic diabetes. So this subtype of diabetes is completely different to type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and it has a different treatment depending on the specific gene that we find a mutation in. And although monogenic diabetes is not very common, we had a suspicion that it was being missed, particularly in people from certain ethnic groups, because they were more likely to be assumed to have a different type of diabetes, such as type 2 diabetes. So we set up this project where a plan to recruit over 1,000 people who'd all been diagnosed under the age of 30 and actually just ignore whatever they thought they had and do some specialist blood tests to look and see if they had genetic forms of diabetes. And we're just analyzing the final results now, because these big studies always take longer than you think they will. But in the end, we recruited about 1,800 people, which is astonishing, really. And what it's shown is that there are misdiagnosed cases of monogenic diabetes in Asian people and Black African Caribbean people. And it is worth picking up those cases because you can treat them differently, and that can lead to better diabetes outcomes. So watch this space for that publication because it's coming out soon.
So what was the difference that initial DRWF funding made to your career?
It was so important from two perspectives. The first one is, if we just rewind over 10 years ago when I got that initial funding, this was not really an area of research that anyone had looked at. So when we're setting up research projects, we often search the literature and see what's been done in this area. And no one had really looked at monogenic diabetes in non-white European ethnic groups. So it really required a funder to go out on a limb. And obviously the project, was a sound project, but to really take a risk on somebody. And that's how I really felt when I went to that interview such a long time ago. I felt like DRWF were funding me as a person, as a potential future researcher. So the study itself I would like to think, has been very impactful. It's contributed to changes in guidelines. And of course, we have all of those data from those 1,800 people that we can continue to study. But so it was really just a springboard for me and the research. And as mentioned, for me personally, it has led to me wanting to pursue research, throughout my career, and to get one of these prestigious and very competitive intermediate fellowships, which has allowed me to continue my research. So it's been very, very impactful is the answer.
So being a member of the Board of Trustees of DRWF, do you feel that's a way of giving back not only to the charity, but to the diabetes community as a whole?
Oh, 100%. Right. So I think I was very lucky in having a relationship with DRWF when I was a PhD student. I can remember going to wellness events and, attending fundraising events. So I remember that very closely. But by being on the board of trustees, I give back in a different way now, because I can oversee the way that the charity is running. And as a research expert, I think that's been really valuable, because I can contribute to the research agenda and how DRWF prioritizes what they will and won't fund, and make sure that they have a research advisory board that's diverse and representative. So to be honest, I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. I just knew that everyone that I had met at DRWF was fun and kind, and I enjoyed working with them. But it's been a tremendous experience to be able to shape and, as you say, give back to DRWF.
And what are your hopes for the future now?
So, I mean, from a career perspective, dare I say it, things are going well. So hopefully I can continue to make useful research discoveries that can change the lives of people living with diabetes. That's my number one professional goal. And from the perspective of, being a trustee at DRWF, my tenure continues. We have lots of exciting things planned for DRWF, including United Through Diabetes, which has been a wonderful, wonderful event. So I think it's looking very optimistic.
Have you got a parting message then for people watching this at United Through Diabetes?
Well, events like United Through Diabetes are so important from three perspectives. Firstly, if you're somebody living with diabetes or caring for someone with diabetes, you can get a real sense of camaraderie by going to these events and just mingling with other people who have similar experiences as you do. Living with diabetes or caring for someone with diabetes can be quite an isolating experience, and this is just a wonderful opportunity to mingle with other people. Secondly, it's really important for me as somebody who is a clinical diabetes doctor, but also a researcher, to hear the views and feedback of people living with diabetes. And that's why I'm there, both as a trustee, but also as a funded researcher. I want to hear what people think about my research. So it's really important for people that practice diabetes and research diabetes to be there. And I think the third reason for these kinds of events is that whenever I go to them, I always come away with amazing ideas. And I'd like to think that the people with diabetes who attend as well also get some ideas and learn new things. We're all in one way or another shaping this journey for people with diabetes, and sometimes when you get together and you just have passing conversations, it can sort of set off a light bulb in your head, and you go on these wonderful journeys. So I think those are the things that I certainly would hope people attending United Through Diabetes would benefit from.
Thanks, Shivani, and our thanks go to all of you for participating today. But I know you also want to thank all the DRWF supporters watching this presentation.
On behalf of the DRWF team and myself and the Board of Trustees, thank you for supporting us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A big thank you to everybody.
I'm Claire Levy, and thank you for joining us today.
Eddie had been unwell for about 2 or 3 weeks. He did end up in hospital. As soon as we went through the doors, they rushed us through. There were people waiting for us, and came back very quickly with results and said quite abruptly, "This is type 1 diabetes." You were moments away from him being in a diabetic coma. And Eddie said, "How long will I have it for? When will it go away?" I think that was the hardest bit for me, the having to tell your own child that this isn't a cold, it's not chicken pox, it's, you're going to have this forever. That was really tough.
I was 19 when I was diagnosed with diabetes. I would feel very drowsy, very tired, was losing a lot of weight. Up until we tried for children, my diabetes hadn't really been a problem. And then after I had Grace, suddenly I couldn't recognise all my hypos, and my life was starting to get very narrow. Professor Johnson put me forward for the islet transplant.
Anne was having problems with severe life-threatening hypoglycemia unawareness, which is where she had absolutely no sensation when she got dangerously low blood sugar. And so at the end of 2012, she underwent her first islet transplant, and then the following year, she underwent a top-up transplant. The pancreas is an organ that sits at the back of the abdomen. A donor pancreas from an organ donor is extracted from the donor. Then the pancreas is processed, in which these islets of Langerhans are extracted from the surrounding exocrine non-islet tissue. And then those islets are transplanted into the patient with type 1 diabetes, and they start to function in a way with producing insulin and controlling the blood sugar.
Being able to have this transplant and the DRWF funding this for me led me to about 3 or 4 months later actually completely getting off insulin and having the best 5 years of my life being insulin free.
In 2017, I found out I had type 2 diabetes. I had to make some quite dramatic changes to my lifestyle. I've lost 10 stone in weight through a lot of help and support. I am now on a background insulin. I do an injection in the evening, and it just keeps my blood sugars under control.
Eddie is part of the Young Athletes Club, and one of the first things he said when we were in hospital was, "Can I still do athletics?" Immediately he said, "Yes, of course you can." And by which point he'd been fitted with a continuous glucose monitor in his arm. The first time back at Young Athletes Club, I was allowed down to the side of the track to make sure that Eddie was okay. And I noticed that his levels were dropping, so he needed some sugar. His alarm started going off, so I had to say, "Stop, come over, have jelly babies." And of course, all the other boys in his group came over. "Why have you got jelly babies?" "I want a jelly baby." "What's not fair? Why are you allowed sweets?" "I want sweets." And he just kind of froze. He just kept hypoing. So I had to say, "We need to go and sit down." I had to walk him all the way around the track to go and sit up in the stands, and everyone's looking, and there's me with a finger monitor trying to get it to work with wet and cold hands. And then he said to me, "Mummy, don't do this again. Please don't do this again. I'm fine." It can be quite a lonely place to be as a parent, and you think, why us? Why him? What do we do to deserve this? DRWF helped us in those really early hours of, what on earth is this? I think as parents, you want to solve the problem, you want to fix things. So to understand why he has it and how he got it and what it means for his future, we needed that information very quickly. And DRWF was one of the only charities that provided that information that we were able to share with others.
I started working for the Diabetes Research and Wellness Foundation in 2015. I think having that contact and understanding that there are lots of different ways that you can get support and help and learn, you don't feel like you're just battling through this on your own. The DRWF charity has a wealth of information, both on the website as hard copy, patient information leaflets. We also have an online forum or group support that you might find a group local to you, or online support. So there's always somebody there.
Having a group of people really to check in and go, "How are you?" And for me to be able to say, "Well, actually, we've had a rubbish week," has been really invaluable.
I think the charity is very much at the forefront about helping people to not only understand their diabetes and to live well with it, but to feel okay about it. You can do it. I've done it. I'm still living with type 2 diabetes, but I'm living well.
I'm so grateful for all those people who gave money in order to allow me to have the quality of life that I've got now. If you can give anything at all towards this really important charity, then I please ask you to do so.